without further ado, I'd like to welcome Jeff Selingo, best-selling author, Washington Post columnist, and one of the original LinkedIn influencers. Jeff Selingo.
Thanks. Thank you, and it's great to be here this morning to kick off your day of discussions about the future of higher education. I want to start by setting this scene of three disruptive forces focused on higher education. The first is a rapidly evolving economy where new inventions, mostly because of technology, are creating entirely new occupations. The second are colleges and universities trying to keep up with this evolving economy by creating new degrees and new programs. And third, it's colleges and universities, some of which are having trouble keeping up with this and trying to figure out where they fit in this future. Now, you might think what I'm describing to you is 2017, right? The year we're living in now. But what I'm actually describing to you happened in the decades before the American Civil War, in the midst of the Industrial Revolution. In other words, we've lived through this period before. It's when colleges and universities, not only in the US, but around the industrialized world, were trying to figure out their role in the evolving economy, right? Because up until that point, they were focused mostly on the liberal arts and mostly focused on educating a very small portion, at that time just men, to be statesmen, to be attorneys, to be in the clergy. And what they were trying to figure out at that time was, mostly because of the Industrial Revolution, how are we going to educate more people for this evolving economy? So it was at this time that we saw the creation of entirely new colleges and universities across the world. We saw the creation in 1850 of the Bachelor of Science degree, right? We didn't even have the Bachelor of Science degree until 1850, and at the time, people thought so little of it that when Harvard created it in 1850, they actually had lower admission standards for the BS rather than the BA, and it was a 3-year degree instead of a 4-year degree. That's how little they thought of the BS degree when they started it. And of course, the biggest change in higher education during this period was in the midst of the Civil War, when President Abraham Lincoln signed the Land-Grant Act, which created some of the biggest colleges and universities in this country, which were focused on training people for this new economy, for the growth of the railroads, for the growth of agriculture, and for the growth of technology that would follow in the decades afterwards. So why do I give you this history lesson today? Because in many ways, we are in the midst of a very similar change in our worldwide economy. An economy that is changing from a national analog economy to a global digital economy. And what does that mean for higher education? Now, in many ways, for all the discussion about all the disruption facing higher education today, in many ways, higher education still has far to go, right? I liken this period in higher education to when Netflix came along and Blockbuster was trying to figure out what to do next, right? Or when iTunes came along and Tower Records was trying to figure out what to do next. Or when Amazon came along and Borders was trying to figure out what to do next. Now, I realize I just named 3 businesses that are now out of business. And I'm not here to talk about how colleges and universities, which I know is a popular mantra right now, about how colleges and universities are going to go out of business. But the changes that we're seeing right now in the economy and in global higher education require us to do more than just incremental change on the status quo, right? It's going to require major changes in how we think about what we learn, who learns, when and where we learn, and how we communicate learning. And this is what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about these changes that are happening across the economy and across the world, and how we as institutions can respond to them. You know, in terms of what we learn, as you know in all of your jobs, the world is rapidly changing in terms of information, right? IBM estimates that our knowledge is doubling every 18 months. And when the Internet of Things comes along, it's going to double even faster, right? The churn of knowledge and the churn of skills needed to come up, to keep up in any job is rapidly growing faster by the day, right? It's why most people want to go back and get an education, just to keep up, right? So what we're seeing are entirely new occupations and new jobs that are evolving ever so quickly. A recent study by Oxford University found that maybe 50% of jobs could be automated over the next 50 years, right? 50% of jobs in all kinds of industries, all kinds of jobs. So if you're in a program that is training accountants, you might want to think about getting into athletic training instead. The only one that bothers me on this is that middle one, that commercial pilots. I don't know, I travel a lot, and there's something that gives me confidence about having a human being up in that cockpit. But in all seriousness, what we need to think as educators is how we're going to employ and help students to complement technology and not necessarily compete with it. You know, technology is not new in terms of disrupting the economy. We've seen this going back to the Industrial Revolution and even before that. But the answer has always been more education, right? It's why we've seen in the early 1900s the growth of the high school movement in the US, and then over the last 30 or 40 years, the growth of college for all movement. Because the idea was, as long as you get more education, you're always going to keep one step ahead of technology. And I think the question on all of our minds is that necessarily going to be true in a world where artificial intelligence and automation might do away with entire jobs. And so what do we do? How do we better help our students at the undergraduate level, at the graduate level, and in lifelong learning? How do we figure out how they can complement this technology rather than compete with it? And we can do that by focusing on whole person education, right? And focusing not just on the hard skills that higher education is very good, but also in the soft skills. Because increasingly, it's these 21st century skills that employers want in today's workforce. So last year, Burning Glass Technologies out of Boston, which many of you are probably familiar with, they do real-time analysis of the job market. And what they did was they scanned and data mined keywords from more than 20 million job ads across the world. And what they wanted to know is, what are those baseline skills that get new employees in the door? And what they found is that in 3 out of every 4 job ads, just 25 skills kept appearing over and over again. And when they looked a little bit more closely, what they found is that top 5 skills kept appearing over and over again, no matter the occupation and no matter the job. It didn't matter what occupation somebody was in or what job they were applying for. These top 5 skills kept appearing over and over again. Things like communication and writing, organizational skills, customer service and problem solving and planning and being detail-oriented, right? Mostly soft skills. There was only one hard skill that appeared over and over again in the top 5, and that's that little icon in the middle. What is it? Microsoft Excel, right? So no matter what you major in, I always tell students, whether at the undergraduate or graduate level, as long as you know Microsoft Excel, you're going to be golden in this job market because people keep asking for it, right? So it's not just the skills that are changing and what students are going to have to learn in the future, but the learners themselves are also changing. And you're probably seeing this on many of your campuses, right? We're seeing a big change not only in the demographics of students coming to campus, but also in terms of their motivations and mindsets, in terms of what they want. And we're also, and this is one thing where I think we're going to have to why we have to focus on the ROI of higher education, because we're also seeing a big change in the financial background of many students coming to your campus, both at the undergraduate level and the graduate level. We're seeing, just like we're seeing an economic divide across the country and across the world, we're also seeing that across in terms of students coming into higher education and throughout higher education. These maps show the percentage of the K through 12 population who come from families making under $40,000 a year, which is essentially at the undergraduate level the cutoff for the Pell Grant in the US. Under $40,000 a year. As you can see, back in 2000, only 4 states had more of that K through 12 population exceeding 50%. Today, we have more than 20 states. 20 states where more than half of the K through 12 population come from families making under $40,000 a year. Ladies and gentlemen, those are your future students, right? This is who's coming down the pike. And if you know anything about population growth and migration in the US, you know that's where all the college students are. That's the largest growth of college students over the next 10 or 20 years. And this, to me, is a challenge facing many of your colleagues at the undergraduate level. But we're also seeing this even at the graduate and professional level as well. How many of you have kids in their 20s or are in your 20s? Right? Well, you're probably, I'm not going to ask how many of you are still getting a check from mom and dad once in a while, or your kids are living in your basement, but we know that this generation in particular is having a much harder time of launching. We know this even with data. This comes from the Georgetown Center on Education and the Workforce, where the average age of financial independence for college graduates back in 1983 was 26. Today, it's 30, right? 30. This is the point where people with a college degree make the median income and also have paid off more than 75% of their student loans. That's considered financial independence, right? And we know that many of today's students are delaying major life purchases, right? They're not necessarily buying homes and cars. They're getting married and having kids later. And in some cases, they're deciding to delay graduate and professional school. Or they're looking for alternatives to traditional graduate and professional school. So last year I came out with a book called There Is Life After College. And I wanted to find out, why is this, right? What is happening with today's young adults that they're taking longer to launch from college? Because we know it's not everybody, right? We all have stories, maybe even our own story of launching directly from college, of finding that great job right out of college and moving through a sector or an occupation quickly and getting promoted quickly. So it's not everybody. So what we did in writing the book is that we went out and we took a nationally representative survey of people in their 20s. And we wanted to find out, what did they do in that period from high school through college, if they went to college, and through their 20s that led them to where they are today. And I think this is key as you think about the ROI of education, right? What are those opportunities that people take advantage of in the higher education space that lead to success later on? And what we found when we took this survey and asked them a lot of background questions about how they got to where they are today, we found that people in their 20s launch into life and into the workforce in one of 3 ways. They're either sprinters who jump right in, and they don't necessarily move with speed, but they're very deliberate about how they move out of higher education and into either the workforce or into graduate school. They're wanderers who take their time, usually half of their 20s, to kind of figure out what they want to do and where they want to go. Or they're stragglers who kind of press pause on most of their 20s, and it's that 30th birthday kind of staring them in the face that get them going. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a wanderer or a straggler. But the problem now is that our higher education system makes it very difficult to find the on-ramp to figuring out what's next to get off of that wanderer or straggler pathway, right? And when we sized these different populations, we found that 2/3 of them end up in those later 2 categories, right? So I think the key as we think about ROI of higher education is, how do we help students, no matter where they are, young adults, no matter where they are, find that on-ramp back into some sort of educational opportunity that will help them for the rest of their careers. Because the fact of the matter is that your 20s are really the dress rehearsal for the rest of your life. right? It's how people end up gaining income over life, but it's also how they set up their careers over their lifetime. Is the key is to be in their 20s. In their 20s is to set up these factors. So what we wanted to find out when we were doing this survey is, okay, what leads somebody to become a sprinter, a wanderer, or a straggler, right? And I lay this out in chapter 1 of the book if you're interested in finding out more. But there were 3 factors that defined a young adult's life from high school through their 20s that led them to where they are today. One was how much debt they had. Second was the number of experiential opportunities, particularly internships they had. And the third was that idea of whether they had the credential itself. And I want to talk briefly about each one, right? So debt, right? We tend to talk a lot about debt in this country, education debt, and around the world for that matter. Right? You can't go a day without reading a story about some college graduate who's struggling with debt. But we tend to talk about it only in financial terms, right? We don't tend to talk about it in career terms. What does debt do to somebody who can't figure out how to move to an expensive city like New York to get that great job opportunity, right? Or they can't take a lower paid job because they need to pay off this debt, or they can't take an internship that might lead to a great opportunity because of this debt. And what happens is students are not, and colleges are not helping them navigate this world as they try to figure out it's not just financial, which we tend to focus on, but it also could impact your career in terms of how much debt you carry on. And we saw this, that the sprinters had a lot less debt, and we know from work that Gallup has done that entrepreneurs in particular they're more likely to start companies and take chances on new ideas if they have less debt. So in terms of the ROI, we have to think about this in terms of how much debt we are saddling our students with. Second, our internships. And this was really the aha moment of the book for me, right? We all had internships probably when we were in our undergraduate or graduate years, but it was something nice to have on the resume. Now, it's absolutely required, and it's required earlier and more often than ever before. And why is that? Because at most large companies now, 75% or more of their incoming hiring pools are coming from their intern pools. In other words, and I heard this over and over again from career service offices, and many of you in the room who might be working in career center offices probably see this as well, is that more companies now are coming to campuses to recruit for interns than they are for full-time employees. And why is that? It goes back to those soft skills I was talking about earlier, right? They no longer trust that the degree alone comes embedded with those soft skills. So they want to try these students out. And what better way to do that? And what better way to know that if they're the right fit culturally for the company or for the organization, or whether they have these soft skills that are so in demand by employers, is by testing them out through internships. And so that's why we found that 80% of sprinters had at least one internship in college. And by the way, 50% of them ended up working for the organization that they interned with. Absolutely critical. And what we're finding, and what I found in my reporting for the book, is that many institutions are not telling students this enough and early enough. Again, as we think about the ROI, what do we have to do to better prepare students to launch into this world? So first, debt. Second, internships. Third is the credential itself. And this, to me, offers a great opportunity for colleges and universities, particularly those in this room. We know that there are 31 million adults just in the US alone who have some college credit and no degree. And the largest proportion of those are people in their 20s. Right? So they're going to have trouble, by the way, going to get a graduate degree if they don't have an undergraduate degree. And on top of that, they have no currency in this job market. Right? How many times have you seen a job ad that says, some college credit required, no degree required, right? Right? We know that they need these degrees. We know that they need these degrees to have the currency in the job market. And to me, this offers an incredible opportunity for colleges and universities. And it's not just the on-campus programs that colleges and universities are offering, but it's how we're going to think about where and when we're going to learn in the future. Right now, we think of education as something that's very linear, right? We grow up, we play for a couple of years, then we go off to K through 12 school, we go off to college, maybe we go off to graduate or professional school, we work, we retire, right? A very linear way of thinking about higher education and about education in general, right? To us, school is something that happens to young people, right? When we think about school, we think about young people, and we think about it happening once or twice in their life, or maybe 3 times, depending on how often they go back. We are moving now to an era of continual and sustained education. It's going to be absolutely critical for us to rethink how we think about students in higher education. So for right now, we think of them mostly as traditional and non-traditional, 2 buckets of students. But we're going to have to think about how do we offer continual education and how do we sustain somebody's education throughout their lifetime, no matter what, and I'll offer a suggestion later on, no matter when they need education. And we're going to need this more than ever before. I talked about earlier about artificial intelligence and automation, and that tends to get most of the headlines about the future of work, right? The robots are all going to take our jobs. But to me, the bigger trend about the future of work that I think is going to have a much larger impact on higher education is the rise of the gig economy. Most of the jobs, particularly in the US, and we know this from studies done by Princeton and Harvard, most of the job growth since the Great Recession in the US has been in the freelance or gig economy. Right? I was across the street a couple weeks ago at Google, and I was walking around and saw everybody with 2 different badges, right? One red, one blue signifies who's a full-time employee and who's a contractor and who's a freelance employee. Google has more contractors and freelance employees than they do have employees, right? More contractors than they have employees. So what does this mean? What does this mean for higher education? Well, think about it. Right now, our continuing and professional development is in many cases directed by employers, right? You go as an employee, you go and every year you get an annual review and they tell you kind of what you're doing right, what you're doing wrong, what skill sets you need. They talk about the opportunities throughout the company that perhaps you can get one day, and here are the skills you need. In some cases, they recommend courses for you. They might even recommend where to go and in many cases pay for it. But what happens when you're a gig employee? And when we think of gig employees, we mostly think of things like, TaskRabbit and Uber, right? But what if you're a gig employee in the white-collar economy, and you're no longer moored to that employer who's helping direct your learning for you? This is a skill set that you have to have on your own, right? You have to self-direct your learning throughout life, and we need an infrastructure in order to do that. And there's no one better, I think, than colleges and universities to help develop that infrastructure. Because today's, particularly young adults, are already doing it, right? They're already looking for education just in time when they need it. We're already seeing this in many different places, and they're already navigating a whole new learning economy that happens outside of traditional higher education. Just in the last 5 or 6 years, we've seen a growth of all these new education providers outside of traditional colleges and universities that provide education just in time wherever somebody needs it, right? And in many of these cases, they're not providing a full buffet, a full course load that leads to a degree over 16, 18, or 24 months, right? They're providing what students need in a particular point in their life because they know, these students know, they're going to have to come back next year, 5 years later, 10 years later to get more. And now we're seeing the growth of even legacy players in the online space get into the learning space. LinkedIn Learning, for example, now, right? Where they know, for example, your skills gap, and they can recommend courses based on those skills gap. And Facebook also getting into this education space. So we are going to see not only your traditional competitors over this decade ahead, but we're going to see new players that you're going to be competing with for these students, which is going to require you to rethink entire programs and entire degrees. And how we communicate that to people is going to be absolutely critical, because we know that in this job market, credentials have currency, right? It's what employers want. But employers are increasingly not necessarily trusting a lot of traditional degrees from a lot of universities. And we're seeing, for example, some big employers like JetBlue and Starbucks, instead of just giving their employees a blank check and saying, go anywhere for your education, they're now signing up exclusively, in Starbucks' case with Arizona State University, and JetBlue with a group of 6 colleges and universities to offer degrees to their employees. Because increasingly, what's happening is that these employers are saying, you know what, this is a very difficult landscape for our employees to navigate. And so we have to figure out how to help them do that, right? And accreditors were supposed to do this. Employers don't necessarily trust that. And what was supposed to happen is that these things that we all love, right, the rankings, right, we're supposed to bring some semblance of order to this kind of confusing ecosystem of higher education. And what's happened instead is that instead of providing clarity, we've just gotten more rankings, right? More rankings, which have really confused students and the marketplace. So what do we do about this? I want to offer today 3 really great opportunities, I think, for colleges and universities to really rethink and reshape and become much more flexible and entrepreneurial and adaptive in this new world, in this new digital economy, that much like those decades before the American Civil War, we have to kind of rethink what we're doing. And the first is to rethink our legacy structures, right? Students don't think in terms of semesters. They don't think in terms of weeks, and they don't think in terms of 18 and 24 months for a degree, and in many cases, they don't even think of degrees, right? And so we're starting to see already the emergence of this new ecosystem in higher education. Things like mini-mesters, which split traditional semesters into 8 weeks, which gives students much more clarity and much more opportunity to take more courses in a shorter amount of time. We're seeing meta-majors at the undergraduate level so that students have the opportunity to think cross-disciplinary at a much earlier point in their career. And of course, we're starting to see nano degrees and micro-masters grow up, which are all being put into an electronic form so that people can track their learning throughout their lifetime. And people want this, right? I'm affiliated with Georgia Tech, which a couple of years ago started a micro-master's degree online in computer science for only $7,000. And what they found when Harvard Education School studied this, they found that this actually didn't cannibalize their on-campus experience like they thought it did. It actually expanded the market for them. A much smaller, cheaper degree that students wanted just in time. And we're already seeing this in terms of even the numbers, right? This shows you the number of graduates with prior awards. We see that the growth in degrees is actually with people who already have them, right? So people already are wanting to stack their degrees throughout their lifetime, and we need to help them do that. We need to help them figure out how all of these programs work together. Second, we need to make education a lot less episodic and much more continuous. Right? Remember, we used to think of education as something very linear, something that happens to us at various points throughout our life. It's no longer going to work. First of all, the on-ramps to higher education are very hard to find once you leave high school and once you leave graduate school to get back on. But second, because of the changes in the job market, because of the changes in the economy, because of this churn of knowledge and the skills that are required to kind of keep up, we're going to continually need education throughout our lifetime. And so we need something that allows us to have opportunities and for continuous education. And we see this in a model that came out from Stanford's D School a couple of years ago. And they called it the open loop university. Some of you might have seen this. They did a big design session around what does education look like at Stanford in the year 2025. And what they did was they kind of turned it on its head, and they said instead of getting access to just 4 years of education when you get accepted to Stanford at the age of 18, we're going to give you access to 6 years of education. And here's the key. You could use it any time throughout your lifetime. right? So you can loop in, you could do a traditional undergraduate degree in 4 years and loop out and still have 2 years left on your clock. Or you could come in, work for a couple of years, go and work for one of the Silicon Valley startups, and then when that fails, you could come back and you could get more of your education at any point throughout your career in your 20s, 30s, and 40s, right? And so what Stanford is thinking about with this idea is that instead of giving our students to all these other players in the higher education space, we're going to keep them in our ecosystem. We're going to keep them in our system. And in many ways, they're never alumni because they're always with us. Finally, we need to rethink education for the hybrid jobs of tomorrow. And when I say hybrid education, I don't mean a mix of online and face-to-face. I mean that we need to provide practical education along with theory throughout our education process, whether that's internships or co-ops or other types of on-the-ground, hands-on work experiences. Because what we're seeing is that the fastest growing jobs are not conveniently packaged, right? They're not conveniently packaged in college majors or college programs. Right? When I talk to students, they tell me, I never knew all these job titles existed. It's like a foreign language to them when they start applying for jobs. Because to them, when they decided to major in something or when they decided to go get a graduate degree in something specific, they thought that would lead to a very specific job. And what they're finding now is that no job is neatly packaged as an academic program is or an academic major. And so we need to start thinking, how do we provide students the theory and the practice for these future jobs? And these jobs require not only the hard skills that I think we're so good at, but it's those soft skills that increasingly employers are asking for. Increasingly asking for, right? And so what we're finding is that there's this increased pressure in the STEM majors and other places to major in occupations that will get you a job afterwards. But what we're finding is that the biggest job growth are not just in the hard sciences, as people keep telling students, but they're in many ways in jobs that combine both social or soft skills as well as the hard skills. So we faced a period, as I said earlier, very similar to this back in the early 1800s. And instead of kind of approaching it with dread and worry, like many people I think in higher ed do now, right? And they think, oh, this time will pass and we'll kind of get back to the old days. There was a lot of optimism in the early 1800s, right? And there was a lot of entrepreneurship. We created all these new institutions, new programs, and new degrees. And I think today we kind of need that same optimism. We need to face this as a challenge, much like we did in the early 1800s. You know, my occupation has been in journalism and publishing, and there's very few industries that have faced as much disruption as publishing over the last 20 years. And in many ways, I sat in seats just like you 20 plus years ago, and I heard somebody up on a stage talking about changes in the publishing industry. And they said, one day, people will want to read a newspaper on a desktop computer. Right? And I said, well, that'll never happen. People always want that thump of the newspaper on their front porch, right? Little did we know that not only would they want to read them on that, but within 20 years, we'd be reading them on devices that we could fit in our pocket. The truth about change is that we tend to overestimate its speed, right? We're always in a hurry because change is going to come tomorrow, but we really underestimate its depth. Little did we know that we would be reading newspapers on devices as small as this 20 years ago. So think about what that means in your own industry and on your own campus about the depth of change. Thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it. And we have time for questions or comments or pushback, about 7 or 8 minutes. There are 2 mic runners. I know it's early, but I always love when people want to ask a question quickly. Thank you. Microphone right behind you.
Question for you on the 3 categories of people. Are you finding that that's correlation or causation? Because wouldn't the people who are more motivated get more internships as a result of being more motivated and maybe work harder and
Not
have
true.
less
So, for example, we thought, and again, I didn't show you all the data today. We thought, okay, sprinters would mostly come from higher income families and go to selective colleges. We actually didn't find a correlation between those two things, right? And actually, we found in some cases colleges where we had the data, colleges that were very deliberate about student agency, developing student agency early on, and helping students, even first generation students, figure out how to navigate this world, actually had more sprinters on a per capita basis, on a percentage basis, than even some selective colleges. Not true across the board, right? For the most part, yes, selective colleges did better in these measures, and students from higher income measures did better. But where there was institutional focus on ROI, those students actually did better, right? Where career services was embedded into the curriculum, where career services wasn't just something on the corner of campus added in your senior year, but was really focused from orientation on, where the programs, for example, co-op programs, we saw this at co-op schools in particular, where students had the opportunity as part of the curriculum to take part in real hands-on work or undergraduate research, so it wasn't just internships and co-ops, but other types of experiential learning. Those students actually had a huge advantage over students who didn't have, at the undergraduate level, who didn't have those experiences. Yes, I mean, some of this is intrinsic motivation. There's no doubt about it, right? And again, for the most part, yes, all those things mattered. She was asking about test scores and other types of intrinsic motivation. Probably the biggest help were students who came from higher income families because they tended to have the network and the safety net under them to take chances that, and they had less debt that students didn't. Other students didn't, sorry. Hi.
Yeah. My question is related to the evolution that education might have, and in a sense, there's a stop that the professors' tenure, it's against probably the evolution. How do you perceive that in a changing world where everybody's saying that the technology will revolutionize the education industry?
And so, what is the role of human capital and professors, particularly in that world?
Exactly, because in a sense, you will probably won't need that much professors because the content will be available.
Content will be available, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't need professors. And I think the biggest change in higher education over the last 5 or 6 years, and I get really frustrated when people say higher education hasn't changed, because I think one of the biggest changes in the last couple of years is the death of the lecture, for the most part, right? And we're starting to see this, right? We're starting to see at many institutions, and I give a lot of credit to the MOOC movement of 2012, and this is that it really pushed people to rethink how they teach. When I go to campuses now, people are proud to show me the Teaching and Learning Center. 10 years ago, they didn't even have one, right? So I think professors are starting to think about pedagogy in a way, not on all campuses and not all professors, but they're starting to think about pedagogy in a new way that really pushes this idea of how do we develop whole person education and soft skills in particular, right? How do we develop those skills that allow people to think about how to complement technology rather than compete with it? Agreed, knowledge is everywhere. Right? So what is the role now of colleges and universities in this new world? And I still think that they have a role, but it's really in developing these social skills and soft skills that are going to become really critical in helping students think in the future. Problem solving, teamwork, things like that I still think are taught best in the environment that we have on our colleges and universities. Sitting in a 300-person lecture hall like this, not so much.
Hi. My question was, what about? I'm just worried about this in higher ed because the future of jobs is coding, design, digital, and if you're not doing that at 13, then you're probably not going to get a job in it, and college won't teach you that.
Right.
So what else can we offer them for that? Because if you're in Silicon Valley, most of them don't have degrees.
Right.
So what are we going to do about that?
Well, first of all, degrees still matter. right? I spent a lot of time with employers of all kinds and all sizes, including a lot of Silicon Valley companies. And you're right, a lot of people don't have degrees, but many of the leaders, and I know Mark Zuckerberg doesn't have one, and I know Bill Gates doesn't have one, and I know Steve Jobs didn't have one, but those are a very small, but if you think of all the other leaders, many of them have degrees. And by the way, many of them have degrees from very elite and prestigious universities as well, right? So the degree is still a very strong signal for the job market that somebody is disciplined and can finish a task, which is very important in hiring. Now, it has a lot of other noise around that signal. So what I think is going to be happening is not that we're going to say degrees no longer required, but we want to know more information about that degree, right? Which is what I think blockchain and block certs in particular, this idea of having more data around the degree is going to become really critical in the next couple of years, because it's not only going to be that degree that's going to be the signal. We want to know what other activities, what other opportunities, what other competencies, what other skills do students come with that degree. So I don't think degrees are disappearing. I don't think liberal arts degrees are disappearing, because in fact we see again, and we know this from even the Burning Glass data, when liberal arts college graduates have specific hard skills, like coding, for example, they actually get hired at a greater rate than other students because they come with these softer skills that many employers want. So I'm not as negative on the degree going away, but I don't think that means that it's only going to be the degree that's going to be the winner in the future. We're going to have to figure out, how do we communicate all these other competencies and skills and activities to employers?
Hello.
One more question, and this is the last question. Thank you.
Hi.
Sorry, raise your hand. Can't. Oh, there you are.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry. You were talking about micro masters and those short master's
Yep.
degrees. I know that while that there is sometimes an issue with starting those courses because they're only 8 weeks,
Yep.
10 weeks, and also that it really affects the graduation rate.
Yep.
Have there been certain studies that or ways that we know to incentivize starting those types of courses and really driving people to complete them?
No, there isn't, and I will tell you, because again, I'm on the faculty at Georgia Tech. There was a big pushback there against starting this master's degree in computer science. People thought it's a shorter degree, it's a cheaper degree, it must not be quality, right? There was pushback. Part of it is starting so this was an experiment. It was started by a small group of faculty with low expectations, and it was started as an experiment that then did well and was scaled up. And I think higher education is very good at starting experiments. They're not very good at the second part, which is scaling it up. So I think that you can actually start, I don't think there's anything up front that we can change to get people incentivized, but I think that if we incentivize people to experiment, start small, see what works. Obviously, some stuff is not going to work, but the more that we can experiment and then scale up from there, the more I think it's going to incentivize faculty and institutions to do this. And I think, again, we saw this with the MOOCs, right? The MOOCs failed in a lot of ways, so I don't want to overplay them. But what I think it did was scare a lot of professors into thinking, wow, I have to really think about my pedagogy, how I teach, where I teach. And they really started to, not everybody, but they really started to rethink how they do their job. And again, the more we could incentivize institutions and incentivize within institutions, small groups, whether they're departments or small groups of professors, to experiment, I think many people will want to do this. And then scale up those boutique programs, because that's the problem I see in most of higher education. People love to show off boutique programs, but it serves a dozen students instead of, hundreds of thousands of students. Thank you very much. Enjoy your day, and best of luck.